The day sound entered the barrack, June 18, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. The smell hit the barrack before the sound did hot dust, pine boards, and something electrical humming to life. Texas heat had its own weight. It pressed down through the tin roof and into our lungs, carrying the scent of sun-baked earth and fresh-cut lumber. The barrack had been built fast like everything in America, raw pine planks still bleeding resin nails bright where the hammer had missed. Dust lay everywhere, a fine powder that rose with each step and settled again as if the building itself were breathing. I was sitting on my bunk boots, unlaced, staring at the floorboards where a knot in the wood resembled an eye. It watched me. Everything in this place watched us wire towers the men with rifles who walked past without urgency. Even when nothing happened, we waited for something to happen. That was the habit the war had burned into us. Then the door opened, not slammed, not kicked, just opened. An American officer stepped inside. He was alone. That was the first wrong thing. He didn't shout. He didn't count heads or check names. He didn't carry a clipboard. Under one arm, he held a small wooden box with a handle, its back laced with wires. For a moment, none of us understood what we were seeing. We were trained to identify weapons quickly. This was not a weapon we recognized. A radio. In Germany, the radio had never been an object. It had been a voice. One voice. One truth. It did not sit quietly in a room. It commanded it. I felt my shoulders tighten without my permission. Around me, men straightened as if expecting an order that did not come. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted his weight and stopped. The air thickened. The officer walked to the center table, the one we used for cards and censored letters, and set the radio down as if it were nothing more than a loaf of bread. The wood touched wood with a dull, final sound. He reached behind it, turned a knob, and the humming grew slightly louder. No speech followed. No warning. No guards appeared at the door. He looked at us for a moment, not hard, not soft, just long enough to confirm that we were watching. Then he nodded, turned, and left the way he had come. The door closed. We stared at the radio. In my mind, 1,000 rehearsed outcomes collided and canceled each other out. This had to be a test. That was the only explanation that fit the world I knew. Tests did not announce themselves. They waited. They watched who failed first. If we listened, we would be marked. If we did not, we would be punished for disobedience. Either way, someone was keeping score. I thought of the radio at home before the war. It had sat on a shelf in my father's living room, its dial scratched from constant use. When it spoke, the house fell silent. We did not argue with it. We did not turn it off. We stood straighter. We learned when to cheer and when to hate. The radio did not ask us to listen. It required it. Here in Texas, the radio said nothing. It only hummed. The sound was wrong. Not the sharp bark of a broadcast beginning, not the familiar cadence of certainty. Just a low, patient vibration like a machine waiting to be used. It filled the space without pushing against us. It did not demand attention. It simply existed. Someone whispered my name. I didn't turn. I became aware of other things than the way sunlight leaked through the cracks between boards, cutting the dust into floating gold. The distant sound of trucks on a road we were not allowed to see. The faint smell of coffee drifting from somewhere beyond the wire. These were not the details a prisoner should notice. They were the details of ordinary life. That, too, was wrong. By 1944, America was everywhere. We had seen it through train windows and Camp Gates factories that never slept, rail yards that stretched past the horizon, trucks moving in lines that did not end. We heard the numbers in whispers, planes, ships, tanks, figures so large they lost meaning. This country did not conserve, it produced. And the radio was part of that production. It sat in American kitchens and living rooms, on shop counters and porch tables. Families gathered around it at night. Children learned the names of baseball players before they learned geography. Music spilled out of it, jazz, swing sounds, we were told were decadent, dangerous, corrupting. The radio was how America talked to itself, and now it was here in our barrack. No one touched it. Minutes passed, or seconds. Time had a way of folding in on itself inside fences. The humming continued steady, indifferent to our fear. I realized my hands were clenched so tightly my fingernails had bitten into my palms. I forced them open and felt nothing. I waited for an order that never came. This was the shock, not that the Americans had brought us a radio, but that they had done it without fear. They had not stood guard over it as if it might explode. They had not warned us about misuse or consequences. They had not even stayed to see what we would do. They trusted the object, or they trusted us. Both possibilities were equally terrifying. In the world I came from, power was loud. It reminded you of itself constantly. Here, power had walked in, said something down, and walked away. It did not need to watch. It did not need to explain. The radio sat there humming softly, a small box of wood and wire radiating a confidence I could not yet name. I did not understand what America was doing, but I understood one thing clearly. Whatever this was, it was not an accident, and whatever came next would not be what we had been taught to expect. Propaganda does not die. Quietly, the radio did not speak that night. That was almost worse. It sat on the table and hummed a steady, neutral sound that refused to resolve into meaning. No anthem, no announcement, no voice telling us what to feel. The longer it stayed silent, the more certain I became that this was deliberate. Tests are never loud. In my head, the rules assembled themselves automatically the way they always had. There were only two possible outcomes. If I listened, I betrayed something fundamental: discipline, loyalty, the last structure that still held me upright. If I did not listen, I survived. Survival had become its own kind of virtue. It did not need to be noble. It only needed to continue. I sat on my bunk with my eyes fixed on the wall, pretending the radio did not exist. Pretending was a skill I had learned well. What we had been taught did not disappear just because we crossed an ocean. Indoctrination was not a coat you removed at the gate. It lived in reflexes and the way your stomach tightened before your mind caught up. We had been warned about this exact thing. The Americans would not beat us. They would soften us. They would give us too much food, comfort music, until resistance dissolved into gratitude. Luxury, we were told, was the most efficient weapon of all. Music, especially. Music slipped past defenses. It made you remember who you were before you learned who you were supposed to be. It blurred edges. It made men sentimental. Sentimental men asked questions. Questions led to doubt. Doubt led to collapse. This had been explained to us carefully, repeatedly over the radio itself. I could still hear those broadcasts in my head even now. The voice had been calm, paternal, precise. It did not shout. It did not argue. It informed. It explained the world so that nothing in it appeared accidental. America was decadent. America was chaotic. America hid its weakness behind excess. Jazz was proof. Noise pretending to be music. Rhythm without order. Freedom without responsibility. We had learned to hear danger in sound. So I listened for it now, not with my ears, but with my memory. Every hum from the radio felt like a provocation. I imagined names being written down somewhere. I imagined guards watching from behind walls, listening for who leaned closer, who tapped a foot, who broke first. Around me, the barrack had changed. Men who had been loud an hour earlier were suddenly quiet. One by one, backs turned. A few climbed into their bunks and faced the wall as if sleep could protect them. Someone pulled a blanket over his head. Someone else pressed his palms hard against his ears, elbows out, rocking slightly. No one spoke above a whisper. "They're testing us," a voice breathed near my shoulder. "Don't touch it. Don't look." The pressure was immediate and intimate. Fear worked best when shared. It did not need an enforcer. We enforced it on each other. If one man failed, the rest would pay. That was how it always went. I thought of the stories we told in training of men who had accepted cigarettes, then favors, then ideas. Men who had come back wrong, smiling, empty, useless. The word collaborator had been spoken like a diagnosis. Once you were labeled, there was no cure. I tried to remember the last time I had heard music without instructions attached to it. I couldn't. Before the war, the radio had already belonged to the state. It told us when to gather, when to mourn, when to rejoice. Even silence had been scheduled. There was no such thing as passive listening. Sound was never neutral. Sound was authority. Here, authority had placed the radio on a table and walked away. That contradiction sat heavy in my chest. I found myself watching the door more than the radio, waiting for it to open again, waiting for the correction. Nothing happened. Outside, boots passed by at an unhurried pace. Someone laughed. Someone else whistled a casual off-key sound that would have earned a reprimand back home. It drifted in through the cracks in the wall and vanished. The longer nothing happened, the more afraid I became. I told myself that this was American psychology at work. They wanted us to undo ourselves. They wanted us to argue. They wanted us to wonder why no one was stopping us. The absence of force was itself a form of force. I had heard this theory before. It had been delivered confidently with diagrams and examples. It had made sense then. It made less sense now, sitting on a wooden bunk in Texas with dust on my boots and a radio humming softly 10 feet away. At some point, someone reached out and turned the volume down slightly. Every head snapped toward him. He froze, hand still on the knob, eyes wide with the realization of what he had done. For a moment, I expected shouting guards bursting and rifles raised. My body prepared for impact. Nothing came. The radio continued to hum, quieter now, obedient to the touch of a prisoner. The man pulled his hand back as if burned. No, someone hissed, "Don't." He nodded quickly and retreated as though he had narrowly escaped something invisible. I realized then that the fear was no longer about the Americans. It was about us. We were holding the line ourselves, enforcing a loyalty that no one was asking us to prove. The test, if there was one, was internal. That made it harder. There were no clear instructions for surviving your own thoughts. In Germany, the radio had given answers. It simplified the world. It told you who was strong and who was weak, who belonged, and who did not. Here, the radio offered nothing but potential. That openness felt dangerous, unfinished. I wondered what Americans heard when they turned a knob. Did they wait for permission? Did they brace themselves for consequences? Or did sound simply arrive like weather, like breath? The idea unsettled me more than any threat could have. By the time the lights dimmed for the night, no one had listened to anything at all. The radio sat untouched, an accusation in the center of the room. I lay on my bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum fade into the background of my thoughts. Sleep did not come easily. Fear kept replaying the same question in different forms. What kind of enemy gives you something and does not watch you use it? What kind of power does not insist on being obeyed? I had been taught that strength announced itself, that weakness hid behind generosity. But lying there in the dark with the radio silent and no punishment delivered, another possibility crept in, quiet, unwelcome, persistent. What if this was not weakness? What if this was confidence? The thought frightened me more than anything I had believed before. You deserve to hear the world. The officer returned the next morning. He came alone again. That, more than anything, told me this was not an inspection. The barrack was awake, but quiet men moving carefully as if sound itself might betray them. Boots scraped softly on the floor. Someone folded a blanket with unnecessary precision. The radio still sat where it had been left untouched, its wooden surface dulled by a thin layer of dust. It had become a presence neither forbidden nor permitted, just waiting. The officer stepped inside and stopped just past the doorway. He did not scan the room. He did not count us. He looked directly at the radio. Then he looked at me. I don't know why he chose me. Perhaps because I had not turned my back the night before. Perhaps because fear has a way of making itself visible. He walked over, pulled out a chair, and sat across from me as if we were equals sharing a table. "You didn't turn it on," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a question. I nodded once. I felt the weight of the room settle onto my shoulders. Every man was listening now, though no one appeared to be. The officer rested his hands on his knees. His uniform was worn not careless but lived in. Dust clung to the cuffs. The insignia on his collar caught the light briefly and then dulled again. He looked young enough to still remember school, old enough to have learned things he would not talk about. "You think it's a trick?" he said. I didn't answer. Silence was safer than agreement. He nodded again, as if I had spoken. "That makes sense." That was the second wrong thing. In my experience, enemies did not validate your fear. They corrected it. They replaced it with their own version of reality. This man did neither. He simply acknowledged that my understanding of the world, however flawed, had been earned. He stood, walked to the table, and placed his hand on the radio. For a moment, I expected him to turn it on himself to force the issue. He didn't. "You deserve to hear the world," he said. That was all. No explanation followed. No reference to rules or regulations. No warning about volume or content. He did not tell us what stations were allowed or what languages were forbidden. He did not tell us how long we could listen or when it would be taken away. He said the sentence as if it were self-evident. Then he stepped back, nodded once more, and left. The door closed behind him with the same quiet finality as before. No one moved. The words echoed in my head, refusing to arrange themselves into something I could dismiss. Deserve. Hear. World. Each word carried assumptions I had not been trained to accept. Deserving implied dignity that did not need to be proven. Hearing implied trust. The world implied something larger than orders and borders. I tried to imagine a German officer saying the same thing to an enemy prisoner. The thought collapsed under its own weight. I began unwillingly to think about the man who had spoken. I pictured a farm somewhere flat and open fields divided by fences instead of trenches. A boy growing up with dirt under his nails and a radio on the kitchen counter, its dial smudged by years of use. Evenings when work was done and voices filled the room, not commands but music, laughter, the measured excitement of a baseball game reaching its final inning. I imagined him listening on Saturday nights, lying on the floor, chin in his hands, the radio telling him about places he had never seen and people he would never meet. I imagined his mother calling him to supper, his father commenting on the score. Ordinary things. Things that did not require permission. Somewhere across an ocean, his brother might have been crouched behind hedgerows in Normandy at that very moment, listening to a different kind of sound, the sharp, final sounds of war. Perhaps that knowledge sat quietly inside him. Perhaps it was why he spoke the way he did, without drama, without force. For Americans, the radio was not a weapon. It was a companion. It lived in the center of the house. It brought the world in without rearranging the furniture. It connected people who would never meet and made them feel briefly aligned. It told farmers about markets and soldiers about home. It made distance survivable. That understanding was woven into the way the officer had spoken. To him, denying a man's sound would have been stranger than allowing it. Silence was not a virtue. Listening was. We had been told that Americans confused comfort with morality, that they believed kindness made them strong. We had been told this was a flaw. Sitting there staring at the radio, I began to understand that it was a choice. The Geneva Convention, as we understood it, was a list of limits what could not be done to prisoners without consequence. Here, it seemed to function differently. It was not a ceiling, but a floor. Not a constraint, but a baseline. The officer had not mentioned it because he did not need to. It was not something he followed out of fear. It was something he lived. Dignity in this place was not conditional. That realization settled slowly like dust after a truck passes. It did not feel dramatic. It felt unsettling. I had spent years believing that power required constant reinforcement, that if it relaxed for even a moment it would be challenged, tested, overrun. Here, power had relaxed deliberately. No guard stood at the door. No one took notes. The radio was ours not as a privilege to be revoked, but as a fact of the environment like the sky or the heat. It was there because the Americans believed it should be. I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not known was tight. For the first time since my capture, I considered the possibility that I was not being managed. I was being trusted. The room remained silent long after the officer left. Men shifted, glanced at one another, looked away again. The pressure had changed shape. Fear had not vanished, but it had lost its clarity. It no longer pointed in a single direction. I stood slowly, every movement deliberate, and walked to the table. No one stopped me. My hand hovered over the radio. The wood was warm from the morning sun filtering through the cracks in the wall. I rested my fingers on the dial and felt the faint vibration beneath the surface. You deserve to hear the world. The sentence did not feel like permission. It felt like recognition. I turned the knob. The hum sharpened, then softened, and then, without warning, something else began to form, thin at first, then unmistakable. Sound that was not instruction. Sound that did not care who I was or where I came from. The world, it seemed, had been waiting. Jazz has no uniform. The sound did not arrive all at once. It crept in, uncertain of its own shape, a loose gathering of notes that did not line up the way I expected them to. There was no opening command, no familiar structure to brace against. Just a piano feeling its way forward, a horn, answering slightly late, a rhythm that seemed to hesitate and then decide to continue anyway. I stood there with my hand still on the dial, frozen, as if the smallest movement might shatter whatever fragile thing was forming in the air. This was not music the way I understood music. It did not march. It did not resolve cleanly. It did not tell you when to stand straighter or where to place your hands. The beat wandered, dipped, surged forward, then pulled back again as if it were thinking aloud. A trumpet bent a note until it almost broke, then let it go. The drums refused to stay behind the melody. They argued with it, teased it, chased it. Nothing obeyed. And yet, nothing collapsed. The sound filled the barrack, settling into the corners, slipping between bunks, brushing against us without asking permission. It was alive in a way that made my chest tighten. This music did not care who was listening. It did not demand agreement. It did not reward discipline. It simply existed. I had been taught to hear disorder as danger. Rhythm without uniformity was weakness. Harmony required hierarchy. But this chaos held together by instinct was something else entirely. It moved like conversation, not command. Like a crowd finding its way down a street without a leader. I became aware of my breathing only when it changed. Slower, deeper, unplanned. Around me, men stood motionless. Some stared at the radio as if it might betray them. Others closed their eyes without realizing they had done it. No one spoke. No one laughed. The sound demanded neither reaction nor restraint. It offered space. And into that space, memory poured. I was no longer in Texas. I was 17 again, leaning against the railing of a small bridge on a summer night before the war had learned my name. The river below moved quietly, unconcerned with borders. Somewhere in the distance, someone played music badly and enthusiastically, notes drifting through open windows. My friends were there, faces I had not allowed myself to picture in years, arguing about nothing, full of plans that assumed time would always behave. I remembered my mother humming while she cooked, never finishing a song, moving from one melody to another without apology. I remembered the way evening sounded when it arrived gently without sirens. The memory did not hurt at first. It simply unfolded. The music on the radio did not guide these images. It did not tell me what to recall. It only loosened the lock. I had not realized how tightly I had been holding myself together. The war had demanded coherence. Belief had provided it. Ideology had been armor-rigid in closing effective. It told me who I was when everything else was taken away. It gave shape to loss and direction to fear. Inside it, there was no room for hesitation. Jazz did not respect that structure. A saxophone took a turn that went nowhere and everywhere at once. The piano answered with something playful, almost careless. The music laughed at its own seriousness. It refused to stand at attention. It refused to be clean. I felt something crack, not sharply, but the way ice gives way under slow pressure. A long, careful fracture that had been forming for years finally opened. My throat tightened. I swallowed and felt nothing move. This was the moment I had been warned about. The collapse. The softening. The dangerous indulgence of feeling without permission. I tried to summon the reflex to pull back to harden to remember who I was supposed to be. It did not come. The music offered no slogans to fight against. There was nothing to argue with. No enemy to oppose. Just sound moving forward without a plan, trusting itself to land somewhere worth being. I thought of all the things I had lost without naming them. Not places or possessions, but versions of myself that had disappeared quietly. The boy who believed the future was a given. The man who laughed without checking who was listening. The part of me that assumed the world would be wide. I felt my eyes burn before I understood why. The first tear startled me more than the sound had. It landed on my hand warm and undeniable. I did not wipe it away. I watched it spread into the lines of my skin, watched it prove that something inside me was no longer contained. More followed. My shoulders shook once involuntarily, then again. I leaned forward, hands braced on the table, and let it happen. There was no calculation left, no audience to perform strength for. The ideology that had once wrapped itself around me so tightly had nothing to say here. It offered no protection from a trumpet bending a note just because it could. I was not ashamed. That realization arrived almost as powerfully as the grief itself. Shame belonged to systems that required constant defense. This moment required nothing. The music did not pause for my tears. It did not reward them. It did not even acknowledge them. It played on. I cried for nights I would never recover, for conversations that ended in silence instead of resolution, for a country that had taught me to confuse certainty with safety. For the years I had spent narrowing myself to fit inside an idea that could not survive a sound like this. The barrack did not react. No one told me to stop. No one turned away. A few men sat down heavily as if their legs had decided without consulting them. Someone breathed out a laugh that was almost a sob. Someone else pressed his face into his hands. The music did not unify us in the way an anthem would have. It did not make us one thing. It allowed us to be many things at once. That I understood dimly through the blur was the point. This music came from a place that did not require sameness to function. It layered differences until they found balance. Each instrument spoke in its own voice, arguing, yielding, pushing forward. No one silenced anyone else. No one disappeared. That America, I realized, was not uniform. It was coherent. The distinction mattered. I had been raised to believe that strength required purity. That anything mixed would weaken, fracture, fail. But this sound, born from cities and fields, from histories colliding rather than aligning, did not break under its own complexity. It thrived in it. The war had taught us to fear that. Listening now, I understood why. A system built on obedience could not survive music that asked nothing and offered everything. You could not march to it. You could not weaponize it. You could only experience it moment by moment without guarantees. That vulnerability terrified me, and it freed me. By the time the song ended, I was exhausted in a way sleep could not have achieved. My face was wet. My chest ached. My hands trembled slightly as I stepped back from the table. The radio moved seamlessly into another piece, unconcerned with my collapse. I sat on my bunk and let my head fall into my hands, not to hide but to breathe. For the first time since the war began, I did not feel held together by belief. I felt held together by being human, and somewhere between the last fading note and the next uncertain beginning, something irreversible had happened. I had listened, and nothing in me wanted to go back to silence. Freedom does not begin at the border. The music became part of the barrack, not as an event, not as a rebellion, but as something ordinary. It played in the mornings while men dressed in silence. It drifted through the afternoon heat and lingered after lights out low enough to avoid drawing attention steady enough to remind us it was still there. No one scheduled it. No one asked permission. The radio remained on the table unguarded, as if it had always belonged there. That was when I began to understand what freedom actually was. Not escape, not release, not the absence of fences. Freedom was the ability to listen without being told what to hear. In Germany, sound had always come with instructions. Music was allowed or forbidden, encouraged or erased. Even silence was regulated. There was no such thing as neutral listening. Every note carried an intention that was not yours. To hear without direction was to invite error. Here in this camp in Texas, sound arrived without supervision. No one corrected our reactions. No one took notes on who lingered or who turned away. The guards passed by without slowing their pace. The officers did not return to check compliance. We were allowed to exist unobserved. That realization did not come all at once. It settled gradually the way a body adjusts to warmth after cold. I found myself no longer watching the door when the radio played. My shoulders stopped tightening at footsteps outside. Fear did not vanish, but it loosened its grip, uncertain of its role. The fences remained. The towers still cast their shadows across the yard. We were still prisoners, but something essential had shifted. In the world I came from, order was absolute. Precision was proof of strength. Every deviation was a threat. The system tolerated no irregular rhythm, no unscripted voice. Harmony was enforced by elimination. Anything that did not fit was removed. That kind of order required constant vigilance. Someone always had to be watching America. I was beginning to see lived with a different risk. It allowed noise. Not careless noise, but human noise. Contradictions, improvisations, disagreements that did not immediately collapse into chaos. The music on the radio made that visible. Jazz did not align itself. It negotiated. It survived on trust between players who did not need to dominate each other to be heard. This country astonishingly seemed to function the same way. Outside the camp, I knew factories were running without pause. Airplanes rolled off assembly lines faster than we could count. Ships crossed oceans in numbers that defied belief. Radios were produced by the thousands shipped to homes, shops, trucks, barracks. The machinery of war was relentless, precise, overwhelming. And yet, in the middle of all that output of steel and fuel and schedules, someone had decided that enemy prisoners should be allowed to hear music. Not patriotic music, not instruction. Music that wandered, argued, played. That choice revealed something no intelligence report ever could. Power did not make America cruel. Power made it confident. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. A nation unsure of itself would have locked the radio away. It would have monitored reactions, imposed restrictions, feared contamination. A weak system protects itself by narrowing possibilities. This one did not. The guards did not need to remind us who was in control. Control was already assumed. They did not need to demonstrate dominance through deprivation. They demonstrated it through restraint. I began to understand that the Geneva Convention in this place was not a checklist. It was a reflection of how Americans believed a strong society should behave, even when no one was watching. Especially then. Dignity was not a reward. It was the baseline. That was a dangerous idea. Dangerous because it did not collapse under scrutiny. Dangerous because it asked an uncomfortable question of anyone raised under a different logic. If you can afford to be kind, what does that say about your strength? And if you cannot, what does that say about yours? I thought of Germany's obsession with uniformity, of how much effort had gone into keeping everything aligned: speech, movement, belief. How many resources had been spent policing deviation instead of building resilience. We had confused silence with stability, obedience with order. America, it seemed, tolerated messiness because it trusted itself to endure it. That trust extended even to us. No one came to reclaim the radio. No one warned us about the content. The music shifted from jazz to swing, from big band arrangements to voices that sounded like they were smiling when they sang. Sometimes the signal faded. Sometimes it cut out entirely. No one fixed it immediately. Life continued. In that continuation, I felt something I had not allowed myself in years. Admiration. Not for weapons or numbers or victories, but for a moral posture that did not need constant reinforcement. I began to see the camp differently. The guards' casual posture, the lack of urgency in their movements, the way rules existed without being shouted. This was not negligence. It was assurance. They did not need to prove who they were. Freedom, I understood then, did not begin at the border. It began in the small, unobserved choices a society made about how much it trusted its own values. It began in allowing sound to exist without commanding it. In letting people respond without correction. That kind of freedom could survive fences. That kind of freedom could travel. Sitting on my bunk, listening to a trumpet wander into silence and back again, I realized that what had changed in me could not be undone by transport orders or repatriation papers. Even if I went home, even if the war ended tomorrow, this understanding would remain. I had seen a version of strength that did not depend on fear. I had felt what it was like to be treated as a human being without conditions attached. And in that recognition, something settled into place that no ideology had ever managed to secure. Respect. Not the forced kind, not the kind demanded by power, the kind that emerges quietly when no one is watching and stays. That I knew was the real victory, not because America had defeated us, but because it had shown us who it was. The war ended quietly for me. There was no moment of triumph, no ceremony that marked the shift from prisoner to something else. One day, the radio spoke of surrender in careful tones, and the next day the guards moved the same way they always had, only with a lighter step. Orders came and went. Paperwork replaced rumors. The fences remained for a while longer, as if the world itself needed time to believe the fighting was truly over. When I eventually left America, I carried little with me. A few letters, a photograph taken too late to matter, and something else that did not fit into a suitcase. The sound stayed. Years passed. The country I returned to did not resemble the one I had left. Cities rebuilt themselves with unfamiliar outlines. Words were spoken more carefully. Memories rearranged themselves to make survival possible. People wanted explanations. They wanted reasons that did not require sitting with discomfort. When my children were old enough to ask about the war, I told them about hunger and cold and waiting. I told them about fences and long days that felt identical. And then, one evening, when the house was quiet and the questions came more softly, I told them about the radio. They did not understand at first. To them, a radio was an object ordinary forgettable replaced easily by something newer. They had not known a world where sound could be rationed. They had not known fear delivered through a speaker. I tried to explain that what mattered was not the device but the decision behind it. An enemy had been allowed to listen. That story followed me as the years moved forward as America changed in ways I could see even from across an ocean. The country that had once seemed impossibly confident began to speak more often of threats than of possibilities. Voices grew sharper, certainty fractured. The easy assurance I had witnessed in that camp, the quiet belief that strength could afford generosity, became harder to recognize. I watched from a distance as America argued with itself. It was not my place to judge. I had been a guest there even as a prisoner, but memory has a way of insisting on comparison. The America of 1945 had believed deeply that it could withstand kindness. It had trusted its own foundations enough to allow disagreement, noise, even vulnerability. It had fed its enemies, housed them, and given them music not because it was naive, but because it was sure. That certainty had been earned. Factories had hummed without pause. Families had rationed without complaint. Entire communities had oriented themselves toward a common effort. Differences existed, certainly, but they did not eclipse purpose. There was an understanding, unspoken but widely held, that some things were larger than fear. In that, American moral strength was not performed. It was practiced. The radio in the barrack had been a small thing in the scale of the war. It did not shorten battles or move armies, but it revealed a posture toward power that was unmistakable. America did not need to humiliate its enemies to know it was winning. It did not need to police thought to maintain control. It knew who it was. Watching America, now decades later, I sometimes wondered if that confidence had become harder to sustain. Prosperity had given way to anxiety, unity to suspicion. Where there had once been an assumption of shared direction, there now seemed to be a constant negotiation over identity itself. I heard echoes of the world I had left behind, not in policy or politics, but in tone. In the way fear narrowed conversations. In the way difference was treated as a threat rather than a fact. In the way sound itself, news music voices, was sorted into camps stripped of its capacity to surprise. I did not draw conclusions for my children. I asked them questions. I asked them what kind of country they believed America wanted to be when no one was watching. I asked them whether strength required constant vigilance or whether it could rest occasionally trusting itself to endure disagreement. I asked them if kindness was a luxury or a measure. They listened. That too mattered. The radio became a symbol in our house not of technology but of an ethical moment. It represented a version of America that had believed its values were strong enough to be shared without supervision. A country that understood that how you treat the powerless says more about you than how you defeat the strong. When my grandchildren came along, the story was told again, simpler now, stripped of its context but not its meaning. An American officer, a radio, music played for an enemy. They asked why. I told them the truth. Because America was not afraid of itself then. Nostalgia is a dangerous thing. It can flatten complexity and erase injustice. I did not pretend that the America of the 1940s was perfect. I knew better. I had seen who was excluded from that confidence, who paid for it invisibly. But I also knew there had been a moment when America believed that moral courage was part of national defense. When it understood that power used without cruelty multiplied itself. That belief had reached across a fence and changed the life of a man it had no reason to care about. That is what I carried forward, not allegiance, not admiration without critique, but memory, clear, specific, and difficult to dismiss. A reminder that nations like people are defined not only by what they fear, but by what they allow. The radio no longer exists. It was taken back, repurposed, forgotten. But the decision it represented still echoes if one listens carefully. The question it left behind has not lost its urgency. When a country is strong, it can afford to be humane. When it is afraid, it cannot. Which version of itself does America choose now? I do not answer that question. I only remember that once, in the middle of a war, it did not hesitate. And because of that, a sound crossed a border that no army ever could. My grandfather never kept many objects. He distrusted souvenirs, especially those connected to the war. Medals stayed in drawers. Papers yellowed and disappeared. Photographs were folded into books and forgotten. When he died, there was little to sort through, little that insisted on being remembered, except the radio. It sat on a high shelf in his study, unplugged, its wooden case dulled by time. The fabric over the speaker was frayed. One corner bore a small crack that had been carefully glued back together. As children, we were told not to touch it, not because it was valuable, but because it was finished. Its work was done. When we asked why he kept it, he never began with the war. He began with music. He told us about a sound that did not ask who you were before it arrived. About a moment when he realized that being listened to was not the same as being watched. About a country that allowed an enemy to sit in a wooden barrack and hear something unnecessary. He never apologized for what he had been part of. He never asked forgiveness. That was not what the story was for. It was an expression of thanks. As we grew older, the details sharpened. We learned where the camp had been. We learned that the officer's name was never known. We learned that the radio had not been a gift but an allowance, something more difficult to offer because it could not be reclaimed without explanation. We learned that no one had made a speech. That mattered most. My grandfather spoke of America with care. He did not romanticize it. He did not excuse its failures. He spoke of it as a place that at a certain moment had known itself well enough to act without fear, a place that had trusted its own values enough to extend them across a fence. That trust had changed him. He carried it into his parenting, into the way he listened more than he spoke, into the way he allowed disagreement to exist without needing to resolve it immediately. He taught us that strength did not announce itself. It revealed itself quietly in choices made when no one was keeping score. The radio became a ritual object in our family, though we did not call it that. On certain evenings we would gather and he would place it on the table not to turn it on but to remind us of what it represented. He would tap the wood lightly once as if to check that it was still there. "It worked," he would say. "That's enough." After he was gone, the radio came to me. I considered restoring it, replacing the wiring, making it speak again. In the end, I did nothing. Silence. I understood was part of its meaning now. It had already delivered what it needed to deliver. The story, however, continued. My children grew up in a world saturated with sound. Music followed them everywhere, stripped of ceremony, consumed quickly and replaced. When they asked why this old broken radio mattered, I told them about a time when sound had been scarce, when hearing something freely had felt dangerous and miraculous at once. I told them that an American officer once decided that dignity did not need to be rationed. I did not frame it as heroism. I framed it as normalcy, because that was how it had been offered. The officer had not expected gratitude. He had expected understanding, and he had been right. My children did not grow up hating America. They did not grow up idealizing it either. They grew up recognizing that countries like people are capable of moral clarity in moments when they are most certain of themselves. That certainty does not last forever, but memory can. Now, when I tell the story, I do not emphasize the war. I emphasize the pause. The moment when nothing happened, no punishment, no surveillance, no demand. Just music filling a room that had been built for containment. That is what stays. The radio still sits on a shelf, its presence modest, its purpose complete. Visitors sometimes ask about it. I tell them it once belonged to my grandfather. I tell them it came from America. I do not explain further unless they ask. Some sounds, I have learned, do not need amplification. They move forward quietly, carried by people who understand what they meant when they first appeared. History will always remember who won the war, but my family remembers who let him hear music.